the truth can be harsh, but ignoring it is a luxury no one can afford anymore. What you're about to hear is a brutal portrait of the American economy, a crumbling empire desperately trying to hide the cracks spreading everywhere. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a small Chinese startup has just shaken Wall Street and exposed an uncomfortable reality. The United States is no longer the center of the economic universe. And if you still believe things will go back to the way they were, well, this audio might change your perspective forever.
In the next weeks and months, as this bombshell has its effects across the world. Of course, we'll pretend that didn't happen. Mr. Trump says it's a wake-up call. Yeah, it sure is. And you've been asleep in a lot of ways if you haven't been able to see all of this coming. I want to talk to you today about DeepSeek, an obscure, small Chinese startup in the technology field that has shaken literally the whole world, starting with the collapse of this week in the stock market here in New York, as one sign of what this little company has been able to achieve. This is another milestone in the decline of the American capitalist system relative to its number one competitor. It's always been true in human history that you can delay technical change, but you can never stop it. The newcomers borrow, steal, buy the old technology from those who went before and quickly understand the gains to be made from taking it further. The Chinese are shifting from specialists in copying technology from the West to becoming the pioneer who develops it and begins to have to worry about who will copy them. It's a small company. It started in May of 2023. That's not very long ago, a little over a year and a half. It was started by an individual Chinese entrepreneur, a small company like many startups in China, because it is a society and an economy which stimulates, supports, finances, encourages startup new companies. His name is Liang Wenfeng, and he followed a directive from the very top of Chinese society that they want to be independent of the United States, which is hardly surprising given the hostility of the United States to them. They wanted to be independent of the chip industry in the United States, partly because it was more advanced than the Chinese. It isn't so much anymore. And because the United States government was banning export of chips and chip-making machinery to China, thereby trying, not successfully, to hold back Chinese economic and particularly technical development. Long story short, using way less money, a tiny fraction of what the money has been in this country devoted to artificial intelligence and the chips that make it possible, for much less money, they produced a product, an AI product, as good in some ways, better in other ways, than what was coming out of the huge monopolies here in the United States that control that industry. And you know who they are because they're in the newspaper every day. And as if to make it clear to the rest of the world what dominates in this country, President Trump's inauguration had behind him in the prime chairs next to the president the heads of these big monopolies, not the political officials that run this society. If you ever needed a symbol of what counts and what doesn't, there you had it. But now the Chinese have upended all of that. They not only produced with much less money an equal or better product, but they also made it freely available around the world via the internet. An extraordinary combination of moods you don't often see. It's almost as if the Chinese were trying to use this breakthrough technologically that they achieved as a way to show the whole world that the dynamic center of capitalism these days, what we in the United States call high tech or Silicon Valley or words like that, that they are able to compete and win there too. It's like the BYD corporation that you may not have heard about either, that has now produced the best quality and cheapest electric vehicles in the world. Or the solar panels that the Chinese now dominate the world economy because they can produce the best quality at the lowest price. What we are seeing is nothing less than demonstration after demonstration of the technical prowess of the Communist Party of China that governs the state there, that supervises their mixed economy. Half private capitalist enterprises, half government-owned and operated enterprises. This hybrid experiment, that is what the Chinese have pioneered. That's what they mean when they say we have socialism with Chinese characteristics. And let me show you some of the lessons coming out of what the deep-seek achievement means. A small company can do better than huge monopolistic giants, whose leaders were sitting there behind President Trump up there during the inauguration. A little company can often be more innovative and more efficient than the big ones. That's a lesson difficult to confront here in the United States, where we have allowed the giants, the Amazons, the Apples, all of them to be super monopolistic enterprises, giving their executives billions and billions of dollars, while most other Americans are worried about next month and next year's finances. But it isn't only the small versus large where this lesson is to be taken. It's also China versus the United States. This is another example, like the electric vehicle, like the solar panels, and more, that they have caught up, that they are now a super powerful economy, differently organized, but able to compete at the highest technical level. These inventions are coming from China, not from Germany or Britain or Italy, and I could go on. Not facing that, which is an American specialty, is like the ostrich with its head in the sand, so it doesn't have to face the wind that's coming toward it. Then there's the old socialism versus capitalism argument. Socialism doesn't stimulate innovation. Gee, China calls itself socialist. And China is proving that its socialism is very innovative, even against the hostility and the discrimination from the giant of capitalism, which is still the United States. And then there's the argument between capitalists and socialism about efficiency. It took billions here in the United States to develop AI chips that the Chinese have just shown us can be done not with billions, but with $6 or $7 million. Yes, I know there are details we don't know yet, and they will modify the story. That is always true. But these parameters, these measures of difference are enormous and are not about to be undone by whatever we find out in the next weeks and months as this bombshell has its effects across the world. No, a socialism proved it could be innovative and proved it could be efficient more so than its capitalist competitors. It's a sign of a declining system. We take billions and a long time to what the new upcomer shows us could be done with lots less money in lots less time. This efficiency and innovation we're talking about is boosting the Chinese economy. People looking for AI chips, and those people are everywhere in the world right now, are going to be going and downloading the free app from this little company. Of course they are. Oh, yes, and you already hear, gee, we should be careful that the data that is assembled here will go back to China. You know, it probably will. But for the rest of the world, here's their choice. They can use American chips and wonder about the data going back to whom in the United States or China. It's no longer just the Chinese you have to worry about, it's the Americans too, which was always true. But in the United States, we like to act as though our things are no danger to anybody. But the Chinese, you see, this is over, this game. The free chip versus paying a fortune to an American monopolist is going to persuade many that the risks, while they're there, point more in the Chinese direction than they do in the American, in terms of where much of the rest of the world is going to go for the use they make of AI. And we would be better off as a nation facing it, sitting down with the Chinese and trying to work out a livable coexistence on this planet, rather than shaking the sword every time our fading empire is shown to be fading. We are hysterical as a nation with the problems we can't solve and the magical scapegoats with which our leaders propose to distract us. Every capitalist around the world thinking about where they like to build their industry up. Do you want to become dependent on the United States as a market? You used to think, oh yeah, I'd love to penetrate that market, to have sales. Whoa, wait a minute. You're now talking about a country that, as a matter of regular politics, discusses and acts to exploit your vulnerability. Oh, you sell here? We'll hit you with a tariff. We'll cut your market off suddenly. There'll be nothing you can do about it. You will have lost all that you invested in building a market there. And in case people are thinking, well, that won't happen, it's already happening. We've talked about it, you and I. The best, lowest priced electric cars in the world are now made in China by the BYD Corporation. All over the world, the competitors of the United States and even American companies active in those parts of the world are able to buy as inputs the best quality, cheapest electric vehicles. But those of the competitors in the United States can't do that because it's twice the price. It's 100% tariff that Mr. Biden put on and that Mr. Trump will presumably maintain since he started the chain of tariffs on China. Okay, that's bad for the United States. That means competitors outside will have lower cost inputs than their competitors inside. And that means in the long run, and on the long run is a few years here, that's shrinkage of jobs here and jobs moving overseas. I thought we didn't want that to happen. But that's a consequence of what you are doing. You're making the United States a pariah, rogue economic partner. And it's going to dissuade all kinds of businesses, private and public, from putting much faith and much investment in the United States. It's a very bad deal that we are showing the world we would do. For 100 years, the Republican Party, the GOP, has been the champion of low taxes. That's its ultimate appeal. That's why the majority of higher income Americans tilt Republican, because the money they want, they want to keep. They don't want to pay it in taxes. And they have the money to buy the politicians who will do that for them. And yet, what have we got? We've got the latest Republican leader being a champion of tariffs. Those are taxes. He's championing raising taxes on all of us for what we buy from Mexico, for what we buy from China, for what? And he's getting it. He got into the White House championing what the Republican Party he leads has denounced for 100 years. If you were wondering whether the economy is changing, there's your proof. Well, then I'm the bearer of bad news. That day is already well underway. New economic reality in the world is called the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which has now mushroomed to 23 countries. For example, last week, Indonesia joined the BRICS as a full partner. Indonesia is one of the largest countries in the world. It has 280 million people. It's just a little bit smaller than the United States. It made a decision to go with an alliance of countries whose core is China, the supposed enemy of the United States. You'd think people would say, well, wait. But here's the worst part of it. The number one goal of the BRICS, to develop means of trade among countries that don't use the dollar or other instruments controlled by the United States, because it's unreliable. No other reason. It's not an ideological. The United States showed that it would seize other people's money. It took Russia 300 billion or 400 billion from Russia because of the war. And then it has been imposing sanctions left and right. It's weaponizing its economic position. And what the BRICS represents is the reaction of the rest of the world to not wanting to be vulnerable in that way. Perfectly predictable. Only they've succeeded in kind of record time, and they now represent well over half the population of this planet. The United States is 4.5% of the population of this planet. There's no contest here. They are making the dollar less and less important in the world. The ramifications, the implications, the consequences of all that, they are worrisome anxieties in the back of people's mind. But all of what's going on is pushing them more and more to the forefront, alongside the specifics of Mexico, Indonesia, and all the rest. Yeah, and that everything points to that tipping getting closer and closer. Nobody, including me, can predict the timing of all of these things. There are too many variables. Each of them is overdetermined by too many influences. So we can only see the broad outlines. We can see rough directions things are taking. But those directions indicate, and this is sort of my final thought for today, we are a weak economy. We cannot absorb immigrants. We cannot tolerate challenging economies like that in China. We cannot hold on to our own alliance. I want to remind you, the European Union includes the country of Denmark. Denmark is the country that owns literally Greenland. And we are now seriously discussing taking Greenland from our fellow NATO member. If that is done militarily, and that is part of what the Trump administration is talking about, that would be an attack on a NATO country. And given the NATO agreement, Part 5 of that agreement, Chapter 5, any attack on a NATO member will be responded to by all of NATO, which means the United States will have to fight the United States. But that's very symbolically, it tells you how out of control things have become. And we can pretend otherwise, we can ignore it, like that we ignored that Indonesia joined the BRICS last week, hardly mentioned here in the United States. It's an amazing process we're going through. The decline of the American empire, the decline of American capitalism, and the whole thing covered over with a level of denial that's pathological. Before I start, I have to ask you to understand that old adage that if you don't like the message, please don't take your anger out on the messenger. I am going to be describing to you as best I can what the situation is with the United States' economic system, which has a name. It's called capitalism. And it is, to give you a hint of where we're going, it is a system in very deep doo-doo. It is in the greatest difficulty that I have ever seen in my life, and you can tell from my white hair that I've been around a while. I never expected to see what I am experiencing. And I imagine for many of you it is the same, unless you are committed to something my psychotherapist wife explains to me as the problem of denial. Not a river in Egypt, but an inability to confront what it is that's going on, because it's frightening. It's a very human thing to do. It's like a little child who puts his or her hands in front of her face when there's a scary dog in the neighborhood, because she still imagines at age 3 that if you don't see it, it isn't there. And if you don't see what's going on around us, then perhaps it isn't there. And that is something which our political leaders and our cultural leaders and our economic leaders, that's one thing they all have in common with very few exceptions, namely a commitment to denial. So my presentation today is going to try to break through all the mechanisms of denial that surround us in order to tell you what I think is going on. I'm not infallible. I make mistakes like everybody else, but this is the fruit of a lifetime of observing U.S. capitalism, which I was born in the United States in Youngstown, Ohio. I've lived and worked here all my life. I have never seen anything like the situation we are in now. And to give you the framework and then jump in, I think that the history of the world is a sequence with interruptions, but a sequence of empires. The Greek, the Roman, the Persian, the Egyptian, the Chinese, I could go on. And they all have something in common. They are born usually out of the demise of another empire. They evolve and change over a period of time, running from a few decades to a few centuries, and then they die. They pass away. The most recent one, perhaps the most and best studied, was the British Empire, which, depending on how you want to count, goes from around the 16th century to the end of the 19th, more or less. So 3 or 4 centuries, depending on how you count. And out of the disintegration of the British Empire, literally punctuated by the war, the Independence War that swirled around Boston, right where you are, a part of that empire broke away. And in an important lesson, the empire denied that this was building, even though it was building across the entirety of the 18th century. Denied it. And then in 1776, the denial blew up in its face as the colonists here in this part of the British Empire, by the way, a relatively small, relatively unimportant part of the empire, wanted its independence. And a war was fought, which, to the surprise and chagrin of the British Empire and George III sitting on his throne in England, the British lost. Not to be forgetful, let me remind you that in 1812, they tried again, and they lost again. And with that, set in motion the disintegration of the British Empire, which ended in World War I. Out of it emerged the American Empire. American capitalism across the 19th century resolved certain key internal contradictions holding them back, most notably the bizarre coexistence in this country of a capitalist Northeast and Midwest and a slave South. That was resolved by the willful destruction of slavery by the capitalists. Remember, the Civil War is the expropriation without compensation of the single most important wealth of the South in this country, the slave. The slave was emancipated and thereby the white master impoverished. A very stark disregard for the sanctity of private property. And capitalism, having destroyed its competitor with enormous violence, took off. Starting in 1870, the United States capitalism had a century of economic growth. The most amazing thing is, if you look at the statistics, crude as they are, especially in the early years, the United States grew uninterruptedly for that century, roughly 1870s to the 1970s. Every decade, real wages of workers were higher than the decade before, even across the Great Depression. Profits grew even faster. So you had this bizarre situation, quite rare in the world, of a capitalism that was able to give rising profits to its capitalists and rising wages to the mass of its workers, with, of course, the exception of those workers with the bad luck to not have been born white. Very important that they sink in. Why? Because if you do something like this, if you have a century of economic growth under an economic system like capitalism, it isn't so surprising that you think of the United States as exceptional, because in that regard, it was. If you're religious, perhaps you think God likes Americans better than he or she likes other people. If you're not religious, you will attribute it to who knows what. Entrepreneurship, my professors used to like to say, whatever in the world that's supposed to be. But it was exceptional. And Americans, whatever their other orientations, took on the notion that we live in an exceptional place, and they then really ran with that ball and began to imagine that this exceptionality was somehow inherent, and so it would last forever. It was upward and onward, the American economy, and it would carry our culture around the world to become the world's culture. Our political system would be the model. Our military would push away those backward people who wanted to resist. It became, and I use this word carefully, crazy. And of course, when the signs began to emerge that this empire, the United States empire, after 100-year rise up, was beginning to show the signs of decline, of peaking, of breaking, it's not surprising that the leaders of such a system with such a history would be deep into denying what had happened, not seeing what was exploding around them. Over the last few days, Americans have been confronted yet again with the level of violence committed every day somewhere in this country by the police against the citizens. And again, there are people who want to blame it on this or that particular policeman or woman, who will not see that this is a social phenomena. It has been going on for a long time, and it is getting worse. It's the same issue. It's the same denial. Okay, what exactly is being denied? Let's begin, and I apologize. I'm going to begin with economics, but that is what I know best, and that is what I have studied all my life. And so if I'm going to be useful to you, I want to share at first what I know best. Over the last 40 years, roughly 1980 to now, we have seen, and all economists of all political persuasions understand this and see it. We all use basically the same numbers, and with a few exceptions, of course, always we come to the same conclusion. Over the last 40 years, there has been a radical redistribution of wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top. And the more top you get, the top 10% have done really well. The top 5%, even better. The top 1%, even better than that. And the top 0.1%, the best of all. And you know them because in our society, we adulate them. I'm talking about Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or fill in the blank. You know them. Our culture makes sure you know them. They became much richer. The top 10% became richer all across those 40 years. This was partly because, very important that you understand this, it was partly because we changed the tax laws in this country. We relieved taxes from corporations and the rich, and we switched them onto the middle and bottom. It was done by Republicans. It was done by Democrats. It didn't matter who was in the White House or who was controlling the houses of the Congress. The Democrats did it a little less quickly. The Republicans were a bit more intense. Speed varied. Content did not. Even more important than the changes in taxes was the phenomena of the relationship between capital and labor. That is, corporations and business on the one hand, and the mass of people, employees, on the other. As I've told you, real wages went up for a century. 1870s, 1970. Why 1970 do I pick that? Now I can tell you. Because that's when real wages in America stopped rising. Absolutely epoch-making change. What is a real wage? It's the amount of money you get adjusted for the prices you pay. So, for example, if your wages go up 10%, you might feel good, but if all the prices you have to pay went up by 10%, you're no better off with a 10% bigger money wage than you were without it because the prices have adjusted. We all know that in economics, so we don't use money wages, we use what's called real wages. Wages understood in terms of what it can afford you to buy. Goods, services, food, clothing, shelter, entertainment, education, medical care, whatever. Real wages rose. In other words, the money wages workers had from 1870 to 1970 rose more than the prices did. So they really got more stuff that they could afford to buy. In the 1970s, that stopped, and it has never resumed. The American working class today earns, in terms of what it can afford to buy, the average American worker earns now what he or she did in 1978. Try to wrap your head around no more real wage increase. For a country that had enjoyed steady real wage rises for a century, this is a traumatic event. How is it handled in the United States? Denial. I won't embarrass you by asking how many of you know what I just said to be the case. How many of you have dwelt in your mind on what it might do to a population used to a rising wage when it is no longer available? There was no discussion at the time or since, no debate in this country. What do we do about all of this? The closest you got were vague gestures in which somebody says, gee, the middle class seems to be fading away, as if this were, I don't know, some sort of cosmic effect, or maybe the result of sunspots or allergies, or who knows what. But an analysis, either of why it happened or of what its consequences were, no, nothing serious. Well, let me tell you what some of the results were. Number one, by far the most important socially, the women of the United States left the home where they had been sequestered for the earlier parts of American history and had to go out and do wage labor en masse. The only ones who had been doing that beforehand were black and brown women. They'd long been doing it because they had to, and the poorest among the whites. But now suddenly all women, all the wives and mothers had to go out. There was no other way to sustain the fantasy of growth, of the American dream, of what had been experienced in the previous century. The second most important effect, Americans began to realize that the only way they could participate in further growth of consumption, the way they had been led to believe was somehow inherent in the American experience, besides sending their wives out to work, besides following a career as a worker in a factory, you could now go back to work and be a greeter at Walmart's. But beside that, you could borrow money. In the 1970s, the banks of the United States decided that the consumer, to whom they had never lent money before, they would now lend money to. In other words, the credit card, which until then had been American Express in the hands of rich people and businessmen, would now become socialized. Everybody's wallet would be crammed full of plastic cards. Live off them. And so the American working class, from around the 1970s to the present, accumulated debt. We are a debt-ridden society in the way we never were before. We became pioneers, not in covered wagons going west, but in what we could cram plastic in our wallets. All the growth of consumption in the last 40 years has been based on women's labor, women's earnings, and debt. Families have become much more complicated institutions to survive. We have the highest divorce rate in the world. We put our families under levels of pressure that would be impossible for anyone to sustain. American women consume more psychotropic drugs than any other population on the planet. Why? Because they are druggies? No, because we put them under impossible pressures, which blew up the family, since the mother was what held the emotional life of so many families together. And she was now as exhausted as the husband coming back from her hours of work. The empire's foundation is beginning to crack. Well, you keep assuming more debt, which the American working class did. It borrowed. It had borrowed with government support for its house. That's how mortgages developed. For those of you who don't know, mortgages were never given to working class people to buy a home until the Great Depression. To get us out of the Great Depression, the government took the step of guaranteeing the mortgages so the banks could lend without a risk. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, because they never did. The American Homeowner Society is a product of the government, not of private enterprise, which was too greedy and too frightened to ever do it. Home loaning, then the car had to be paid for with loans because working class couldn't afford it. Then the credit card, so you could buy everything. And then in the last 20 years, a new indebtedness, the college student. So by now, the family is dying, floating in levels of debt it cannot support because the underlying wage didn't go up, just the debts. And it doesn't take a PhD in economics, although I have that, for you to understand that if the underlying wage doesn't go up, you can't keep accumulating debt because the time will come, and it's called 2008, and that's why that song is so appropriate, when the credit system exploded. Cracks in the empire. This system is so committed to inequality that not only did it grow over the last 40 years, as wages stopped rising, of course, where would workers' income go? They couldn't grow. Their wages were flat, but they were becoming more productive all the time. The last 40 years are the computer, the robot, artificial intelligence, all of that. Workers' productivity goes up. Workers' wages are flat. Wages are what the employer gives you. Productivity is what you give the employer. If what the employer gives you is flat and what you give the employer keeps rising, guess what? You have inequality. You're taking all your growing output and giving it to one small class of people. Employers are 1%, 2%, 3% of our population, if that. They get it. Even across COVID-19 pandemic, inequality got worse. And what did we do to the working class? After we gave them 40 years of losing everything, their families falling apart, their position in American society, their growing wealth, a kind of affirmation that somehow you're doing better. All of it's taken away. Then we hit them with COVID. Then we hit them with an inflation. And now we're hitting them with rising interest rates. Let me frighten you, if I may, if what I've said hasn't done that job already. There is an example in history of another working class over a small number of years being hit with economic blows on a scale of what's happening here. The example is Germany, and here's how it works. In the second half of the 19th century, as the British Empire is declining, the United States is not the only competitor looking to replace the British. There is another one, Germany. World War I defeats Germany. Britain, with its allies, defeat Germany, throw them out of the competition, wipe them out, impose at the end a reparations they couldn't possibly pay. The German working class, which had been built up across the 19th century to believe it was creating a whole new globe. In German, it's called das Deutsche Reich. That's like the German Empire. And it had, territories in Asia, it had territories in Africa, and so on. All that was smashed when the unthinkable happened in 1914 to 1918. Germany was defeated. The empire was taken away, literally. The British took the colonies in Africa away from the Germans and made them British colonies. Everything for them destroyed. It was a trauma for the German working class. It ended in 1918 with defeat. Within 4 years, late 22, early 1923, literally a century ago, Germany then experienced the worst inflation in modern times anywhere in the West. In a period of 9 months, the German currency went from 6 Deutschmark to the dollar to 4 trillion Deutschmark. to the dollar. Prices doubled over weeks at a time, every hour of the day. Any savings accumulated by a German family, and they were very frugal, were wiped out. 6 generations saving money, had enough money put away to buy a quarter pound of butter. They were done. And 5 years after that, in 1929, the Great Depression hit Germany. It was too much. You cannot hit a working class, even the German working class, which was the best educated, most productive, and most progressive working class anywhere in Europe. No contest. Even that, it was too much. And in 1932, those German people, overwhelmed by what they had been put through, turned around and supported a little Austrian with a black mustache, Adolf Hitler, and you know the rest of the story. We're just living out, here we go, the same sad scenario. Denial, not explaining to people the foundation of what they're assuming, not talking honestly about its disappearance, the cracks, what it means when your empire has that fun ride up begin to be replaced by the much less fun ride down. We're in very deep trouble. For the last half century, we have benefited enormously by the fact that there's one international currency, money. It's the US dollar. It's as good as gold because it literally functions like gold. That's over. Ukraine simply speeds up the process. China, Russia, now Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, and many more countries are signing up for another international currency, and it shouldn't come as a big surprise whose currency that is. It's the currency of the People's Republic of China. China shows all the signs of a rising empire, matching all the signs of a declining empire here. You may not like that information. You may be upset by it. That's your business. But to pretend it isn't there, let me give you just some numbers. I'm an economist. We do that. One of the things we do as economists is we look at the size of an economy to gauge relative economic power. And the number we use, it's crude like all numbers, but it gives you an idea, is called GDP. It stands for Gross Domestic Product. It's a measure of the output of goods and services in one calendar year. So it helps us if we look at it and we measure it, and it's measured for every country on this planet. It gives us an idea of the relative size. Okay, let's now do a comparison of 3 countries, Russia, China, and the US, to get a sense of their economic wealth, their economic power, their economic footprint, if you like, in the world. To give you an idea of, and if you didn't know this, think about what that might mean. Now China. What's the GDP of China? Ready? $17.5 trillion. That's a competitor. Not Russia, China. That's the empire emerging. Not Russia, China. And why? Easy to explain. Over the last 25 or 30 years, annual growth of GDP, how fast is the economy growing? Here in the United States, 2%. Maybe slightly more, 2.3%, somewhere in there. Let's be generous, 2 to 3%. US, average annual growth. China, average annual growth, 6 to 9%. End of conversation. That's why China went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being the competitor of the United States, one of the richest. You know what it's like? It's a story a little like a colony in North America being a place for furs and then becoming the new empire, so that the roles between Great Britain and its colony were reversed. Now Britain is our colony, as any honest appraisal of the relationship between these two countries would immediately acknowledge. In Britain, one of the most common jokes you can hear is that when the United States tells Britain to jump, the response of Britain is, how high? It's a question. China has overtaken the United States in dozens of fields, particularly the highest tech ones. Young people around you are using TikTok. That's Chinese as a social media. What's going on? The United States doesn't know what to do. Having not learned the lessons, having not understood what denial means, for a long time, they denied. Because to see the rise of China is to take a step in the direction that might make you confront what's happening to you. And that's a taboo. Finally, the United States figures it out. And what does it do? As if it learned nothing from its history, it tries warfare. It tries to slow down, to stop, maybe even to reverse history, just like Britain did. Mr. Trump declared a trade war against China. You remember? It's not that many years ago. He applied sanctions. He applied tariffs. He did everything he could to stop, to reverse it. None of it worked. It was one big, fat failure. It's over. But you live in an environment which needs to deny it. The divisions in our society become worse with each passing day because they're grounded in a reality that isn't changing. Inequality, as I'm speaking to you, is continuing to get worse. Corporations are working as hard as they ever did to pay no taxes. The mass of people are suffering on a scale that is unspeakable. The inflation we're still at, prices are going up roughly twice as fast as wages. That's a destruction of the working class. Prices are going up twice the rate of wages. This is impossible. You can't do this without explosions. Now, the explosions are happening in our country. So they explode how? By taking it out on one another. Crime, bitterness, resentment, a politics of scapegoating. I mean, how else explain preposterous notions that become serious? This is a country, United States, of 30 million people. The biggest estimate I've ever seen of undocumented immigrants in our country says 10 million. Okay, there's no way 10 million of the poorest people there are, immigrants from Central America, are the cause of the difficulties of a capitalist economy of 330 million people. That's silly. That's on a level, that an elementary school kindergarten kid wouldn't come up with something as off the chart as that. You're desperate. I understand that. You've been suffering. You have. You have a right to be angry and upset. No question. You do. You have been screwed in this system, having been led to believe by those 100 years that the opposite was waiting in store for you. Instead, you're being slapped and whacked and deprived with no end in sight. I teach at the university. I'm surrounded all the time with people in 18, 19, into their 20s. They are not happy, this generation. They don't see good jobs. They don't see good futures. They don't see any of it. They were led by their parents and this culture to expect what they now know they're not going to get. And they want some answers too. The most recent Gallup poll indicates that a majority of Americans polled randomly, 35 years of age and younger, when asked, would you rather live in a capitalist or a socialist economy, the majority say socialist. After half a century of ideological pressure against everything social that I grew up in, I'm a product of that. This is amazing that the points of view could be twisted like this. And when you talk to students, as I do about this all the time, I quickly learn the polling is correct. But it's not that they like socialism. They haven't a clue what it is. Those votes, that polling, is because they are angry at capitalism. They know that that system is not for them. Socialism, let's try that. But it's not that they like socialism. It's that they don't like capitalism. But that has to be faced. I'm not making these numbers up. You can't come away from what I've just said with an imagination that all is well in this empire. But I'm not done. So let me end with military. Since the end of World War II, the United States has invaded small countries repeatedly, violating norms, rules-based international order. It invaded Korea. It invaded Vietnam. It invaded Iraq. It invaded Afghanistan. It lost all of them. The wars were lost. Korea, Vietnam, they all were lost. The Communist Party of Vietnam took over that country. The Taliban took over Afghanistan. I could go on. They lost. They didn't win. They lost. I'm asking you, look at the reality you have in front of you. Don't be afraid. The danger lies in denial, not in facing it. And if we face it, there is a lesson to be learned from the British Empire. After 2 attempts to militarily force the United States back into the British Empire, after those 2 efforts had failed, the British Empire stopped trying and decided instead to try to work out a relationship with the United States, which it did. Not the greatest job, but did a pretty good job. The biggest waffle came in the U.S. Civil War when the British seriously considered siding with the South. They didn't, but they came close. After that, though, once they could see who won there, they went with the winner. A very courageous move once the war was over. But maybe we have to learn that we have to live with the People's Republic of China. It has virtues. We could learn from them, just as they could learn from the United States. And that to be a better plan than what they're doing now. The American 7th Fleet is in the China Sea. There is no Chinese fleet on our border. We are there. We are threatening them. We always have. This is a country that is now our economic competitor. Its global political reach is extraordinary, and it has 4 times the number of people we do. And now that they're closely allied with India, you're talking about the 2 largest countries by population on this planet. You better come to terms with them, because the prospect of defeating that in a war, that's a war everybody loses. So you don't have that option unless you're crazy. We have to stop the denial and face what is going on. Otherwise, we are going to get ourselves into one mess after another. And who's going to do it? The corporations that are profiting from this system? Unlikely. The rich who have become richer for 40 years, are they likely to question a system that has rewarded them that way? Unlikely. You know who's going to do it, if anybody does? It's the mass of the people, the employees of this culture. Or, if you allow me the old language, the working class, because it's their ass that's on the line. They're the soldiers and they're the taxpayers who keep the system going. And that's probably why denial has won over honest confrontation with our reality. Marx once said that the capitalist class will in the end destroy itself. The question for all of us and all of you is, will we let that system take us down with it? Now, China is a lender to the United States government. China has been demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of U.S. debt by hundreds of billions of dollars. The whole world. Economic growth is faster in the East than it is in the West. The G7 and the BRICS had the same total GDP in the year 2020. Now the BRICS have about 3 or 4% more than the G7. Capitalism has always had financial problems. The way the system works produces financial problems. Here in the United States, we have a governmental system that works as follows. On the one hand, you have corporations and the rich. They are a minority, but they provide the money for political parties. The political party, Republican and Democrat, spend an enormous amount of money. They buy time on television. Everything is done by mass media, by social media, and so forth. So for a candidate or a party to win, they need to get a lot of money. And that money comes overwhelmingly from corporations and the rich. And they don't want to be taxed. So what corporations and the rich want from the government is lots of service. They want 800 military bases so that nobody will interfere with exports or imports or all of that. They want the government to help them, to educate workers so that they are productive, to all of that, prisons, We have an enormous prison population, all of that. Then there are the mass of people, the working class, the employees. They too want services from the government. They want schools, they want hospitals, they want roads to be working, and so forth. And they don't want to pay taxes either. But they're not so powerful. They don't have any money to give the politicians, but they give them votes. And the politicians, once a year, need some votes. So we have the following capitalist system. Politicians, faced with the need to raise money from corporations and the rich, but without the power really to tax them. Because if you tax them, they won't give you the money. They'll give the money to somebody else who's running against you. You'll be out of there within the next year or two, and in will come somebody who plays the game. And likewise, you can't keep putting the taxes on the mass of people because they don't have enough, and they're going to rise up again. That's dangerous. So you have to provide services, but you can't tax. How do you handle that problem? And the way that capitalists have handled that problem in the West is by borrowing, because that way we can spend it on what people need, but without taxing them. It's just, and they will vote for us and they will give us money. And that's how it works. But the problem is you accumulate an enormous national debt, adding up each year's deficits between what the government spends and what it raises in taxes. The important thing to understand about this, though, which many people don't, is that this is very good for corporations and the rich for as long as it lasts. Why? Because when the government borrows, who does it borrow from? It borrows from corporations and the rich. Nobody else has money to lend to the government. The government lets corporations and the rich not pay taxes and then comes back to them and says, lend the government the money that you didn't. For corporations and the rich, this is, of course, wonderful. Instead of paying taxes, say goodbye to your money, they get to give the government a loan, which the government will pay back plus interest on the loan. So for corporations and the rich, going ever deeper into debt is perfectly acceptable, which is why corporations and the rich are now permitting, here in the United States, we run deficits in the trillions of US dollars every year, like this year. And corporations and the rich, they worry only because at a certain point, when you borrow more and more, you run the risk that some of the lenders, the very corporations and the rich, will decide it is too risky. You are so in debt that there may be an uprising from the people which will say you cannot repay the debt. You have to take care of us first. Now, China is a lender to the United States government. China and Japan are the number 1 and 2 lenders to the US government. China has been demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of US debt by hundreds of billions of dollars over the last few years. This is an important sign that in China, too, there's the beginning of the worry that the debts are going up so fast that you're getting closer to a crisis when the mass of people say, we will not continue to pay the taxes. You need to repay the debt, which you only got because you weren't willing to tax corporations and the rich. That's why in the United States, an enormous amount of time and energy is spent by leading economists to explain deficits and national debts in every conceivable way other than what I've just told you, because they don't want the mass of people to realize that a debt is simply postponing the burden of taxation on the employees in order to benefit the employers who get out of paying a tax and have a government loan instead. If the mass of people understood what I've just told you, then they would not allow this kind of deficit spending, and they would demand that taxes be raised on corporations and the rich because they have evaded their share of taxes for many years, and because they are the richest and therefore most able to pay to get out. But my guess is we're not going to solve this problem until it blows up. And if you ask me, when will it blow up? I can't answer that question, because that's a question really of when does capitalism run out of its mechanisms to stay in power? I think that capitalism is declining everywhere in the world, with the exceptions, perhaps, of Asia. And now comes my important point, I think. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen the latest relocation of the dynamic center of capitalist industry and growth. It has left Western Europe, it has left North America, and it has left Japan. And it has gone, above all, to the People's Republic of China, but also to places like India and Brazil and Vietnam and other parts of the world. But it has left the old part. And that is how capitalism has always worked. It has always relocated following where profits were the greatest.
What you just heard isn't theory. It's not fear-mongering. It's the cold, hard truth. The American economy is stuck in a dead end, and pretending otherwise won't change that. The real question is, will you keep ignoring the signs, or will you prepare for what's coming? In the pinned comment, I've left a list of books that dive even deeper into this topic, essential reads for anyone who wants to truly understand the shifting global economic landscape. Go check it out and let me know in the comments. What's your take on all of this?